how's it going? So in this video, what I want to talk to you about is a question that has been posed to me recently by a Christian. It's a family member, and let me get right into the question that's asked. So the question that's being asked is, considering the disciples, including Paul's, state of mind, and the absence of any motive, how are we to account for the change of mind on their part in regards to the resurrection? They go on to say that there can be no question that they came to believe, and with certainty, in the resurrection as a historical fact. Well, let me start with that. Okay. One of the first problems I have with it is they say, considering the disciples. Okay, well, let's consider the disciples. First of all, I don't know, and many scholars don't know, and they're of the opinion that what we have in the Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they are not historical record because, one, they're not written by eyewitness accounts. Okay, so we don't know whether it's a historical event or not, and we don't know who the writers are. We know the names of the books, but those are not, if you study this, you'll find that those are not the names of the authors. Though for many years, Christians and people thought that was, that's attributed to the apostle Matthew, or the disciple Matthew, or whatever, and same with Luke and John and Mark. But that's not something that we can corroborate. So since we can't really corroborate that, I'm going to not discredit, but I'm going to push aside anything that the Gospels say because we can't corroborate it as historical evidence. Now, I'll turn to Paul. I believe Paul was a historical person. I think we can corroborate that. We do have 7 out of the 13 epistles that he's alleged to have wrote having been authenticated that they were originally written by this man, Paul of, I forget where he originally, I think it's Tarshish, I think that's where he was from. But anyhow, we have Paul as most likely being a historical figure. There is a problem I do have with the fact that only 7 of the 13 epistles attributed to him were actually validated based on the language that was used, and 6 other epistles that were, and I can't recall right off the top of my head which ones they are, some of you may know, that are not accepted as Pauline epistles. And the way they figured that out was because the language is different. The writing, and so Christians will say, well, they'll acknowledge that, we acknowledge those who weren't written by Paul, but they were written with someone that knew him, or this and that. But that's not the same thing as Paul writing it, and it's not makes sense to have a pseudographical epistle attributed to something said to be written by one person, but then it turns out it's really not. That's not helping your credibility in the New Testament as this is authentic. What you have is people writing in the same vein as Paul, but that's not the same thing as Paul writing like he did with the first 7. I think it's Galatians. I can't remember them all, but you can look it up. Anyhow, the point was just that I believe Paul was a historical being. Okay, so we have to consider if Paul's a historical being. Allegedly, he has this conversion on the road to Damascus, and the problem with this is that none of us were there, right? So we only have Paul writing about his alleged experience, which could have been, we have to allow for the possibility, it could have been a hallucination. He could have been taking mind-altering drugs, but again, it doesn't say he did. He doesn't say that he was, but he says he had some kind of conversion. And the fact that he may or may not have allegedly persecuted Christians, again, can that really be corroborated? And if so, by which source documents, other than just the Bible, can it be? And that's the problem for much of what's in the New Testament, is if we can't corroborate it with any secular sources, I mean, that's a bit problematic. Why is it only that people writing this stuff were the people that were writing Christian propaganda? That's a bit problematic, in my opinion. So anyways, Paul was probably a historical being. He did write some things, but that's the question. Why was Paul writing what he was writing? And I made a video about that a while back, about why any of the early church followers would have written anything about, Christianity, would have written anything about the risen Christ. But the question that was asked in this is what motive, what reason would Paul have had to believe in the resurrection? Well, now let's look at the difference between, I've already kind of discarded the apostles and their stories, what's told in the Gospels by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we don't really know if they're reliable or not. I mean, I know many Christian scholars, many apologists, they're like, the best explanation for why we have what we have is in fact that the risen Lord did raise from the dead. And okay, I don't believe you, William Lane Craig, but whatever. But Paul appears to have believed it. So what reason would Paul have to believe in it. Well, first of all, Paul doesn't write very extensively, doesn't write much of anything except for that, okay, yeah, he was crucified and he rose again. Okay, so he has that belief, but there isn't much in terms of details, which is very problematic because Paul wrote earliest before the Gospels were written, and one would expect that if he talked with Peter, James, and John, these supposed, if there really were real historical people, I don't know that they were. How would we corroborate it outside of the Bible? Probably not very well. You say, well, there would be some Roman record because allegedly Peter was crucified upside down. Yeah, so maybe these guys existed, maybe not. I'm thinking that's probably less likely, but let's say they did exist. Paul, who supposedly at some point in his epistle writes that he went back to the head office, to the head honchos, as I think it was Gary Habermas, a Christian apologist, had said that he was discussing with Robert M. Price about this, and said that what's wrong, Bob, with them going back to check with Peter, James, and John to make sure that the gospel that he preaches is okay and it matches up with what they. Okay, well, is that what he said he did? Did he say he went back to them and then he blessed it and said it was okay? All right, fine. Maybe he did. Maybe what he was preaching. But we don't know. Again, we can't corroborate that these events actually took place. Well, at some point, we just have to take at face value that what Paul says he believes, and maybe the stuff happened, maybe it didn't happen. But if he did talk with them, wouldn't he have had more details about the crucifixion? And wouldn't he have made references? Well, you remember when the Lord said, I'm just saying, look at what Paul writes, about the theology and stuff, and how it just kind of skims over the and then look at the great detail that the Gospels have, and one would expect that what we have in the Gospels, Paul would have at least known and would have at least written something to that level, but he doesn't. It seems like he knows about that there was a crucifixion, and that the story says he was risen from the dead, and there was a resurrection on that Sunday morning. Okay, but he doesn't write anywhere near on the level that the Gospels write, and that's a bit suspect to me. I'm like, well, he writes before the Gospels. He should have had access to that information. Even if the Gospels had used like a Q source, one would think that Paul would have had that same information available to him because he wrote the closest to the time of the resurrection, only at 50 AD. So, anyways, but Paul, for whatever reason, he felt compelled to write this. But again, that doesn't mean that just because Paul believes something and that he believes in the certainty of the resurrection as a historical fact, just because he wrote about it, that doesn't mean that it's true. I mean, there were lots of other stories, there were other things that were written about other rising and dying gods, that those people wrote it, and you say, did they really believe? Oh, we weren't in the mind of the person that wrote it. We weren't in the mind of Paul, but yeah, okay. Everyone that's ever wrote some kind of amazing story means that they truly believed it in their heart, and even if they did believe it, that doesn't mean it's a historical fact, and it doesn't mean that those events actually took place. So I think when you ask that question, what was it that caused them to write, to believe what they, especially Paul, what would cause him to believe? I don't know. Maybe he had a hallucination on the road to Damascus. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he did have something, but we don't know. But Christians would never take what the folks of Islam say, and say with Muhammad, when he allegedly had some kind of conversion in a cave when angels came to him and said, write the Quran, Muhammad, and that's what he did. But Christians wouldn't accept that as being coming from God, from Allah, right? So why do we expect it to believe that the same kind of thing happened with Paul? And Paul is the first person that starts Christianity before the Gospels are even written. He's pretty much the grandpappy, the grandfather of Christianity. He's the founder of Christianity. He's the one that put it out there. So just because he writes this stuff doesn't mean he had some kind of actual experience from the risen Lord, and that he actually appeared to him just because he says that. I mean, this could have been rumor mill stuff that was floating around that time, around Jerusalem about this guy named Jesus that may or may not have existed, and he grabs a hold of it, and there may have been Jews that, like these Peter, James, and John, that were believing, they were like, oh yeah, Jesus was the Messiah that we've been waiting for, but there were many Jews that still didn't believe. What happened with the Sanhedrin? What happened to the Pharisees? They didn't believe any of that stuff, and that's because Jesus didn't do the things that he needed to do. So what would compel Paul to believe that he was the Messiah that was prophesied to come? I think just his own idea, his own invention. I think he just made it up. I mean, it's not like the Christian story is super original in that, what it entails about a Savior that dies for his people and provides salvation. That wasn't unique to Christianity when you read your pagan religions. So it's not like what Paul was talking about was something so unique and unheard of in that time period. No, he's just borrowing from other pagan religions and taking what's available. And that's how maybe he didn't start it per se. Maybe he just grabbed a hold of it and said, you know what, I'm going to start this religion. So he starts writing to all these other churches and trying to instruct them. He's trying to start a new religion. So if we're looking for a motivation, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If we're looking for a motivation for what would have caused this man Paul to write what he wrote, who knows? There's any number of reasons why someone might write it, but it doesn't have to mean only that, because it was a historical fact and these things actually took place. There are other explanations that we could have, and it could just be that this is what Paul believed. But why did he believe? Man, who knows why people believe some of the outlandish things that they believe and write about. But that doesn't mean they were historical events. It doesn't mean it's a historical fact. But that's kind of the framework in which Christians begin. Well, Paul believed it was a historical fact. Who gives a shit what Paul believes, okay? There's lots of people that believe all kinds of wacky shit out there, but that doesn't mean that what they believe is true, is my point that I want to convey in this video. So Paul probably existed, but just because he wrote some epistles and wrote this stuff and felt so compelled, you say, oh, well, what about Peter? He was so, this is many of the things that Christians will go to. Peter believed in everything, and the Gospels write about it, and he didn't believe he was worthy to be crucified like the Lord, so he was crucified upside down. Where can we corroborate that? Is that in the Roman records that he had a choice of how he could be crucified? Did the Romans give two shits about what any Christian's request would have been? No. This is probably all Christian fabrication. This is all probably Christian embellishment made up over the centuries. I mean, that's what I allow is plausible to me. I could be wrong. It might not be that. But I think the best explanation for what we see, why we see Paul writing about this stuff, is that okay, he believed it. So what? No one's going to dispute whether Paul believed it. He apparently did believe in what he was writing about. Okay, well, what would cause him to so fervently believe what he believed? Man, going back to my argument before, there's lots of people that believe in all kinds of crazy stuff, and it doesn't mean that what they believe in and what they may write about. I mean, David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, back in the 90s, they thought he was Jesus Christ and come in the flesh, and they were dead wrong because, the ATF and FBI and everybody descended on there and obliterated him. So if he was really Jesus, he would, it was the second coming. But you just say there's all these false prophets. So Paul could have been in the same vein of in the Bible. He talked about, beware of false prophets. You say, well, but they have to attest, and if the Spirit is within them, then, and what Paul writes, is consistent with what, God would want. And okay, but Paul also wrote stuff that was contradictory to Jewish belief, okay? And Jesus appeared on the scene and said that he didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So, and he also says that it's easier for, heaven and earth to fade away than for one jot or tittle of the law to go away. So Jesus was obviously a Torah-abiding Christian. Now, this is probably debated, not Christian, excuse me. He was a Torah-abiding Jew who believed that the Torah was something beautiful, and many Jews would say, yeah, Jesus, that's what he says. So Jesus didn't come speaking out against the Old Testament laws like Paul does, but Paul needed justification. See, when Paul was going to bring forth this new version of Christianized Judaism to the Gentiles, he needed to do away with a lot of the laws because whacking off the old foreskin wasn't probably going to be a big seller. You know what I'm saying? So he did away. Paul does away with the law. So the reason he does away with the law, he has to explain in a experience that none of us can verify because we weren't there. We don't know. And he says, oh, well, Jesus came to me. This is what he told me to write by divine revelation. So you can't call into question because you weren't there. You don't know. Maybe God did, through Jesus, reveal this through this appearance to him. And did he actually come in the flesh? We don't know. But the point being is, I can see that the reason Paul was writing what he was writing was to sell a watered-down version of, not really watered down, but a slightly different version of Judaism. That's what he was doing, and he was bringing it to the Gentiles, so he had to remove all the law that the Jews followed so he could sell this to these churches in Galatians and Ephesians and Thessalonians, all these churches, because, they were basically pagan people that probably converted to this belief, and, they were not Jews, and they were not going to go for circumcision. They were not going to keep the laws. I mean, hell, as we read in the Old Testament, Jews had a hard time keeping the law at times, at least that's the account that we have in the Old Testament. So I think that's why Paul was writing what he was writing. And maybe he really believed it, but you know what? Just because we have text and we have this something written about something, a story, or we have theology, or we have Paul writing stuff, that doesn't mean that Paul was correct and that he did get it from God, or that this is divine revelation, or that, and one of the tellers, I think, one of the markers for me is the fact that what Paul says is different than what God had a covenant with the Jews. What God communicated to the Jews in the Old Testament all those thousands of years, Paul now says doesn't matter. We're saved by faith in Christ. We don't need to keep the law anymore. And Jesus never says this. He never says that, he says, oh, maybe something by your faith you will know this or that. But he never says that we need to stop following the Jewish law, is my point. So I wanted to use this as another example, because I mentioned videos back that I was going to talk about in examples of how Paul speaks out differently. And I probably really need to give you some more examples, go in and actually show you from the New Testament where Jesus will say things that are at odds with what Paul's saying. So I think the fact that we see Jesus and Paul at odds with one another in terms of what they say is an indication, or a marker, as I said, of that basically Paul is speaking and teaching something different than what God, which I don't believe the God of the Old Testament was real either, but God of the Old Testament had instructed the Jews. And I think you see that this is a Christian invention. This is a new religion emerging. That's why Paul was writing what he was writing. Again, I could be wrong, but I think that the evidence, when we look at it honestly, what we see in the New Testament with some of the problems and the contradictions, this is why we have what we have, is because Paul is out on his own. He didn't get anything from God. There was no appearance by Jesus. He had to say all of that to justify why he's preaching something that's this heresy, basically, to the Jews, that contradicts prior teaching that was supposedly of God. So why would God be changing his mind and sending his risen son, his son, to come in the first century of all times, after thousands of years of him having a covenant with the Jews and telling them to keep the law? No, that doesn't matter anymore, says Paul, says you, Paul. But who is Paul? Under what authority? Well, the only way he could have authority was to say that Jesus had appeared to him and that Jesus gave him the gospel that he preaches. We'll see you next time. Take care.